Mono Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Liberty and Friends, only on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. My name is Sihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. Man, it's been a while since we've had regular content on the show. Trust me, it's good to be back as I'm fighting off the urge to sneeze. And maybe whilst I'm fighting that urge off, let me hit the like button and remind you that whether you're watching this broadcast on Facebook, YouTube, or on Twitter, the like button helps a great deal in publicizing the show for whatever reason, augmenting it, getting it into other spaces. Another way you can do that, of course, is to hit the share button after the broadcast. If you're watching this broadcast, particularly on YouTube, welcome to it. But just make sure you hit that subscribe button, please. Help me grow the audience I have on there. My goal is to reach 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Now, with that being said, a reminder that we have a website. Find us, please, at www.bigdaddyliberty.com. There, of course, you'll find ever increasingly as we go forward, more information on the changes, the launch, if you will, of some new content coming your way. There'll be a lot of changes to the Big Daddy Liberty brand as we grow it into something much, much bigger, an alternative media space for you to enjoy, to get the analysis, news, and opinion you will get nowhere else but here. With that being said, welcome to it. My name is Sihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. And remember, Liberty and Friends is the one long format show that we have. It's usually about 90 minutes. It can become longer when we have a lot of topics. What are those topics usually? Well, on this show, we look at the week that was. You know, what are some of the things that got you talking, interested, crying, sad, happy, you name it. We discuss it here, provide compelling analysis from a revolving door of friends panelists. Tonight on Liberty and Friends, we are joined, of course, as I see them trickling in slowly. He is, of course, the host of the Daily Friend Show. You'll find them at dailyfriend.co.za. I'm talking, of course, about Nicolas Lorimer. Nick, good evening, Baba.
How's it, man? Very good to be back.
Dude, good to have you. As I just adjust my audio. There we go. Now I can hear properly. Welcome to it, Nick. Good to have you on the show. Another chap who, of course, is a co-host of another podcast, very popular on the social media streets. I'm talking, of course, about the Man Patria podcast host, Ukoketso Resane. There he is on screen.
Le guy.
I've been here in Joburg for 3 months, so I'm getting accustomed to my Sutu Setswana. No, I'm not.
Yeah.
Dude, how you doing?
No, I'm great. Reading. Good to be back as usual. And yeah, let's have fun tonight.
Excellent, brother. Good to have you on. With that being said, I see some of my other guests are having some technical difficulties. Guys, load shedding. You know how it is. Their load shedding has only just ended at around 8 p.m. So they'll be trickling in slowly but surely. Now, with that being said, with the fellas who are on at the moment, guys, let's kick the show off. Actually, before I do that, a quick reminder. Guys, you are the extra, you, the viewer, are the extra voice tonight. So get your comments in. I'll flight them on screen and get your questions in too. Tonight on Liberty and Friends, we're looking at two issues broadly. The main one for tonight will be, of course, the BRICS Summit that was held in Johannesburg, specifically Sandton, this week. It saw, if you were in Sandton, the complete shutdown of that area, including of the airspace, an annoying, occasional flyby of those Gripen jets, or the Griffin jets. I don't know if it's Gripen or Griffin. And of course, a massive security contingent, which I discussed this week on the Vukanazo show in the context of it's very interesting to see how this government, this ANC government, is suddenly able to prioritize security and actually have a very good security apparatus for effectively foreign nationals coming to a BRICS summit. But for us, ordinary South Africans, dololo. For us, we had to endure the usual violent crime in this country, to which the recent crime statistics have pointed out there's no real difference in that regard. But again, let me not waffle on. Let me bring my guests in. Chaps, I think the first area I want us to just get a kick-off of tonight's show. Your view on the BRICS Summit? Your initial reaction, really, to it, Nick?
Yeah, so it seems to have gone, I think, fairly well as far as the BRICS guys are concerned. I mean, they're inviting these new countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and Argentina, which I think is going to make it a more interesting place. Some of those are like a big win. Saudi and the UAE are desperately at the moment trying to diversify their economies away from oil. So I think they're pretty keen on like any form of economic cooperation. Although I wonder whether they were actually just brought in because Iran was brought in, and China is currently trying to do this complicated thing where it's trying to be the peace broker between Iran and the Arab states, because they've had a very bad relationship over the last, decades, actually. Ethiopia, I think, would have been a bigger prize to get into the group a while ago, but not so much anymore because it's been racked by these horrific civil wars, the one in Tigray, the ongoing one in the Amhara region and the Oromo region. So that's not very good. But the fundamental problem with BRICS remains, and I think it's this, which is that it's not really clear, I think, what this thing is. So it's a forum, and it's going to have these institutions and stuff. But over the last decade, we've had things like the BRICS banks and stuff, and they've not really made much of an impact. In fact, I've read that the BRICS Bank is not doing that great. And as part of, if you look at it as, it's a geostrategic bloc. It's like an equivalent to sort of the G7 or NATO or something like that. It's not really that either, because India and China have fundamentally different views on geopolitics. And then you've got a country like Brazil, which kind of wants to stay out of, I think, the big geopolitical clash. You've got Russia and China, they get on well, and they've got, I think, a similarly aligned geopolitical goals. But China and India, I mean, these are both countries together in BRICS, and yet they've been putting tariffs on each other, blocking imports of various things. India and China ban each other's technology regularly. Over the past couple of years, they've had actual soldiers fighting with each other, now with sticks, not with guns. But still, that's not a great place to be. And also, India very much views itself as being opposed to the increase of Chinese influence. So I almost feel like in terms of BRICS, India is just staying in so that it can put a fly in the ointment of China. But with the new invites, it really does seem increasingly like this is, I think, more and more a Chinese influence group with Brazil and India standing awkwardly in the corner there. I think I remain a bit of a BRICS skeptic in that it's an interesting thing, but I'm not quite sure what impact it's really going to have on global politics.
We'll unpack a lot of the themes that you're raising during the course of tonight's show, because I think you're spot on some of the areas that you're touching about, especially those internal contradictions around the, let's call it, bilateral relations between BRICS countries versus the facade they put on of a multilateral BRICS that is going to challenge the Western hegemony, which is what we've been hearing on social media. We'll cover that too in a second. Koketso, I want to give you your opening remarks. And even as I do that, and before I do that, let me just say hello to Nolu Maki, who I see is here with us, I think. Let me get her on camera. I'm skeptical to do it. Okay, there might be a bit of a glitch. I will let her resolve that in the background. Okay, so as I said, your opening remarks, really, a lot of pomp and ceremony involved in this thing. Are there any tangibles?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'll just plus one to what Nick was saying as well. I think as a summit, the BRICS Summit has been a success. Overall, there seems to be a little bit of a focus here that can BRICS actually put together a show for themselves to firstly, I don't want to call it grandstanding, but really show that they're able to come together and pull off the sort of thing primarily attributed to, Western powers, be it the UN Security Council, the G8, the G20, etc. So from the top, BRICS Summit has been a success and has demonstrated to the rest of the world that yes, these countries do mean business, and barring Russia can actually put everyone in one place and show the rest of the world really that they can shake hands without essentially without the West. In terms of the tangibles, yeah, the BRICS Bank is actually a very good thing to bring up. No one really knows what the bank is set up to do. Let's forget about what's written on paper here regarding its goals, its ideals, and its intended purpose. But in the material world, no one really knows what the BRICS Bank is trying to achieve. My suspicion here is that it will at the very least create an avenue for BRICS members to really, let me say, effect some level of borrowing from each other in a collective pool, instead of approaching something like the World Bank, and instead of approaching someone like China directly, which would of course draw the ire of Western nations and show a country, typically as South Africa or Brazil, as unable to, again, European banks primarily and American investors. So we don't know much in terms of what they are actually set out to achieve, but maybe the conversation to have is what is coming. Lots of talk, of course, around the currency, but from what I can see, and this isn't my area of expertise at all, but from what I can see, really, BRICS at the moment, before the new members come in, when they come in, BRICS at the moment seems to be a group of sorts where China, and primarily China and maybe India as a close second, have access to preferential export markets as a sort of trade bloc to rival something like the European Union maybe and some others. But yeah, at the very least, it looks like it's creating a choice of preferred export partners for the Chinese manufacturers. We know that China's unique problems with having such a large population is how do you keep your people busy? And you can keep them busy in low-hanging fruits like primary sector, primary industries. But in terms of manufacture, etc., what is the end goal here? Where do your end products go? And there's only so much you can do inside of your own borders. And we're starting to see the effects of some of that even right now within BRICS, how Indian cars or cars manufactured or assembled in India have really flooded the South African market at the expense of typically cars that would have been imported from European and American makers. We all know that Chevrolet, for example, has left the country, and some other manufacturers haven't been doing too well from Europe. The likes of your Peugeot, Citroën, and a couple of others. And this is all because cars are simply cheaper to import from India, and they're cheaper to import from India because of an arrangement such as BRICS. So it's creating preferential export partners for its members. The real question then is when we introduce some new ones, this is where it gets very interesting with oil, with OPEC members coming in, the likes of your Saudi Arabia, East Africa and allies would be very interesting, of course, because your Egypt and even Ethiopia have access to that Red Sea, which is a primary mode of transport for in the global shipping and logistics supply chain industries. And this is why China and America, even the French, have all been scrambling to put some element of a military base and using countries like Djibouti as pawns to do this. So there's a lot in this geographically, but it gets a lot more interesting when you consider who else wants in on this. With new members coming in, we may have a scenario where the Suez Canal and some of the seas closer to Central America, namely closer to the Panama Canal, could all be having BRICS members, having an element of control there. And that would mean big business for the global shipping industries and the likes. So yeah, that's just two of the things. There's a few more to cover, but let me keep quiet for now.
No, we'll definitely get onto them. Trust me. I think tonight will be, there's two overall questions I want us to answer tonight, especially for the sake of the viewer. And if I'm to be brutally honest, for the sake of the average South African who perhaps didn't give a flying fudge about this BRICS Summit. That was one of the great ironies of this BRICS Summit. Lots of pomp and ceremony, lots of mainstream media and indeed political elite interest in it, but it was just another week for most South Africans, which begs the question, as I mentioned in the episode we covered on Wednesday, a good friend of mine who's passed on, Ian Cruikshanks, a lot of you know as the famed economist who used to be at the Institute of Race Relations. Ian Cruikshanks, one of the things he taught me is when analyzing an issue, ask yourself the question, what does it mean for us is the question he always used to ask. And we're going to answer those two questions tonight. As I said, what was the BRICS Summit? What did it mean for us as South Africans? And also the second question, the broader question that we'll speak about the geopolitics of it all is this a challenge to the West? Should America and Europe, should they be panicking? All panic stations, it's going to be $1 to, it's going to be one BRICS to a $55. Is some of the stuff I've been hearing this week. You'll forgive me again for the humor. I'll play you guys some clips along these lines so you see exactly what I'm talking about. There has been panic on the social media streets in particular. Before I do any of that, let me bring on my other guests. I did mention that they were slightly affected by load shedding, that boon to our society. I was being ironic. There's no boon to it. Nolu Maki, of course, who joins us all the way from the Cape. She's experiencing load shedding right now. Nolu, good evening.
Good evening, Sihle. Good evening to the panelists as well. It's been a while since I've been here. Thank you so much for having me. And again, I'm sorry for being late.
No stress at all. You know how it is. ESCOM keeps African time in the traditional sense of that expression. Another awesome guest who we have tonight on the Friends panel is, again, analyst and a chap who is very, very popular on social media, depending on how, of course, you define popular. Phumlani, good evening, Bob.
Hey, hello everyone. Hello Nolu, Koketso, Nick, how are you all? I hope you're good. Great to see you, Sihle, again on your show. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. And indeed, you have joined us at an interesting time. I've just completely lost my control panel. I don't even know if I'm on camera at the moment, but nonetheless, you've just joined us at a very interesting time when we were actually beginning to have this conversation. I had no sense of whether I'm on camera or not.
You are still with us, Sihle.
Just give me a second, people. I have no idea whether I'm on camera or not. But nonetheless, if I am, let me just power through this weird little moment. You just joined us, Phumlani, at a very interesting bit where effectively we're beginning to answer and ask rather the question, what does this BRICS Summit that we just had mean for us? Number one. Number two, is this a challenge to the US and Europe hegemony? Now, I was going through the roster of panelists just to get those initial comments before I start peppering you guys with questions. Maybe, Phumlani, let me begin with you. Just your initial reaction to that BRICS Summit. Lots of pomp and ceremony. Okay, I may have lost Phumlani.
Sorry, I'm losing Sihle. Is it only me or is it?
Okay, let me just do a quick check as to who's on. Guys, thumbs up if you can hear and see me at the moment. All right, I've got Nick, I've got Koketso, I've got Nolu. All right, Phumlani, I'm going to put you on standby for a moment and maybe pose that question to Nolu. Nolu, your initial comments, your initial reaction, really, to those 2.5 days of a BRICS Summit. Your thoughts?
Honestly, I'm not going to lie. I'm also that ordinary South African who was just going about my day, going about my life, because so many things are going on in this country, especially when it comes to everything that is expensive. Of course, that's not an excuse in terms of not being, not giving much attention to this whole summer thing. First of all, I think I was quite annoyed by this for this part. Ramaphosa called us to tell us to behave because he's got some visitors. And we had had so many major things before that. It's like a dad's like, you know what? You better make sure you don't embarrass me in front of these people. We had really major issues before all of this, which I was hoping he would truly be a president and represent us on those issues and call us, and bring some hope and give us confidence to the country. All of that was not done. It was just about BRICS. So for me, that was my first thing, or rather, that was my first 10 down. I'm like, you know what? I don't care, Ramaphosa, about your BRICS and all your chommies and everything that you want to discuss. But on a greater scheme of things, I also think that the whole summit, I think it was needed. And I guess in terms of nations forming alliances with other nations, I do believe it is a good thing. And I'm glad also Egypt and the rest of others were part of now they are part of the BRICS, what's this collection or alliance? So I think in terms of the country, it does need those alliances. And I know that there are certain things which I might not be fully in full understanding. What does it mean for us? But and how it will impact us as a country. But what I do know, though, is that we ended up being the country that is being saved by China. Because I think China gave us money for our railway, if I'm not mistaken. So in all of that, I think it still puts it in a place where we are the ones who are the weaker nation among all of the nations that were there. But then at the same time, like I said, I think it is a good way of creating alliances, because you do need alliances in this business called politics. And kudos for Ramaphosa and his buddies. But yeah.
I think Nolu raises a good point, one which actually maybe I didn't view this from this perspective, rather, because I'm usually very pessimistic about the state. Generally, I don't think government's good at doing pretty much anything. But nonetheless, Nolu makes a good point. In terms of the PR exercise, Ramaphosa came out tops from this. He looked presidential as F, if I can put that expression like that, as the young people say. And I'll take it one step further, Koketso. For a president who's been under a lot of pressure, under a lot of bad PR recently, to the extent where even the leader of the third largest political party in this country, Julius Malema, was for a while projecting himself as being, I'll be super important at the BRICS Summit. He just totally became irrelevant over this period, and it was spotlight on Ramaphosa.
Yeah, I think maybe we should give Ramaphosa more credit here in terms of his actual skill set. Again, in our individual and collective disdain for the ruling party and really anyone in that top six, we shouldn't take away from the fact that, there are still people who are capable of achieving. And Ramaphosa, Cyril Ramaphosa he's very skilled in, let me say, projecting an era of confidence and competence that some within his organization simply lack. So he's been very able and certainly displaying to the rest of the world that South Africa does belong in BRICS. Of course, when you look at GDP numbers, like Nolu mentioned, we're a lot smaller than some of the other countries in there. But again, on capability, Cyril does make a case that we do belong there and we do fit. And this is why countries like Iran and Egypt, etc., are also coming to the fore. Argentina is another one saying, okay, well, we want in, and the validation for that is you want a global block of sorts. We can help you globalize even further. And if you are willing to accept countries who perform in the way South Africa does, then there's a case for them as well. So Ramaphosa has been very skilled at that. Malema wants a pie of this, specifically because with all eyes on South Africa, the populist wants to not be an afterthought. So, of course, he wants to make noise about it, and he's going to milk the opportunity and, make use of the, I forget the right PR term here, but really twist this as an opportunity for him to be gearing to the top of the trends list again. Funny enough, though, he seems to have been behaving because his ideological superiors seemed to be in town as well. So more likely he was trying to garner a meeting behind closed doors where he can facilitate a handshake. And yeah, he was definitely not going to get that by making noise about it in his usual manner. So good behavior from Julius Malema as well.
Very interesting way of putting that. Guys, apologies for the glitches tonight. It happens for whatever reason, especially when people are experiencing load shedding. It's not their fault, it's not our fault. I hope it doesn't deter you from tonight's broadcast. Speaking about tonight's broadcast, my name is Sikhle Ngobese, host of tonight's Liberty and Friends. On Liberty and Friends tonight, we're joined by the host of the Daily Friend Show, Nicolas Lorimer. There he is on screen. Host of the Man Patria podcast, Koketso Rasane. And of course, Nolu Maki, who's the host of the, is it the Nolu Maki show? I made that up. Remind me, Nolu?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
There you go. There you go. Host of the Nolu Maki show. Of course, another guest who is, I think, back on our screen is, there he is, Phumlani Majozi. Phumlani, good evening, Baba. I'm going to have you jump straight into it because I've given everybody a chance to give just the initial reaction to the BRICS Summit. Lots of pomp and ceremony. And again, I wanted to chew on this for a second. There's a little bit of hypocrisy here too. Look at how organized the ANC government was when it came to this BRICS Summit. Everything seemingly running smoothly, perfectly. The security picture when it comes to Gauteng and more specifically Sandton was almost perfect. This was the kind of society you want South Africa to be, where it's super safe. But why give foreign nationals visiting for a summit this level of safety and neglect actual South Africans who pay for all of that technically via their taxes? Was that not a hypocrisy that the ANC missed?
Oh, well, I mean, I stay here just not far away from Sandton. And then I had another TV interview on that, I think a day before or something. And then I drove through Sandton. I'm telling you, there were police every robot, every traffic light. I'm like, we don't see this in normal times if there are no international leaders coming here. So I mean, so I get your point on that front, and I think you do raise a good point that as soon as there is that international attention, or there's a big event, that's when we see the government sort of looking as if it's doing things that it usually does, when in fact most people do not have that experience of seeing the police at every corner of their local communities, and where they stay, I would say. But then I think before I got cut off, your question, I think I heard you raising two sort of questions you wanted to explore. The first one was what it is that South Africa gains, what is there with this BRICS Summit for South Africans. And then your second part was the geopolitics, right? But I would like to explore the first part, which is around
Can I put a quick break on that one? We'll get in that one.
Sure.
We'll get to that in a second. In fact, you'll be the first person I come to with that particular question, because I'll first look at the geopolitics and the panic, Phumlani and other guests, that seemingly the social media and the traditional media in places like the United States and the Europe were having as this BRICS Summit was going ahead. In fact, to that point, let me quickly just show a little presentation to give viewers a sense of the absolute panic that hit these social media streets. Just give me a second, people, as I load it. Even as I do that, a reminder to you, please hit the like button as you watch the show and join us for tonight's Liberty and Friends. There we go.
America has pissed off the rest of the world. We've been the bully with this thing. We're now a credit-based economy. In other words, we print fake. America has pissed off the rest of the world. We've been the bully with this thing. We're now a credit-based economy. In other words, we print fake money and we spread it throughout the world. But the rest of the world is actually producing the food, the gold, the silver, the machinery, and all this. So finally, the rest of the world said, enough's enough. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That was the original BRICS. And now they're gaining force.
It's not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. You have well over a dozen countries that have already applied, such as Algeria and Argentina and Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Nicaragua, Turkey, Indonesia, Senegal, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Egypt, Kazakhstan, and the biggest one of all, Saudi Arabia, has formally applied to the BRICS nations. Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Thailand, all of these countries and their neighbors that are growing together are forming a massive, very imposing, not only from a GDP, but you put all these countries together and their military might is very, very strong as well. And those are the BRICS plus. Now they're talking about adding more countries, including Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Bolivia, Chile, Cuba, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, Azerbaijan, Mongolia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. The list goes on and on.
So the rest of the world is saying, enough of you sending us your toilet paper.
That's exactly right.
You take our materials, you take our production, you take this, and you send us this trash here.
BRICS, Brazil BRICS, Russian BRICS, the Indian BRICS, Chinese BRICS, South Africa BRICS. They ain't talking Gucci man, but they've been talking BRICS. So these 5 countries came together with the intent to make America's dollar equivalent to 0 cent. If that happened, even wealthy people won't even be rich, because everything we've ever known quadruples in the expense. Picture this: for 1 BRICS dollar, America needs 55, which means they gonna overcharge for all of their supplies. Your Jordans made in China, price range by different size.
Or BRICS currency, whatever that's going to be. So let that sink in for a second. $55 for $1 of the BRICS currency to trade within that trading block. Now, have you considered, when this comes to pass, what that's going to do to the cost of imports for the United States? Where all of a sudden, instead of buying stuff overseas from a position of strength as the world's reserve currency, where, you know, they would always get way more currency in a foreign country because they held the US dollar, which was quite strong. Now that's being flipped on its head. So now they are importing from a position of weakness rather than strength, where, you know, $1 is, oh, sorry, $55 equals $1 of
dollars to their $1. Do you not understand what is going to happen to our economy if that happens? We were just sitting here complaining about eggs $10. Can you imagine how much we're going to have to pay now? If we went to one of these countries and wanted to buy $20, 20 of their dollars worth of goods, do you know how much we're going to have to pay? That's $1,100 for a $20 item.
Excuse me, guys. I was just saying, you can see the absolute panic on these social media streets. And it's no different even in the traditional mainstream media. I wasn't going to play that montage. I've got to prepare for tomorrow's episode of Vuga Nazo. Again, and Phumlani, I must come to you because this speaks to perhaps how there is a, much like all of Shakespeare's work, the common theme amongst all of Shakespeare's work is the idea or the notion of appearances versus reality, the appearance of the BRICS Summit, the appearance of those BRICS leaders, if you will, sort of holding hands and then making the announcement that they're going to have 6 more countries join, including 2 of the largest or rather oil-producing nations in the world. The appearance has a lot of people, at least on the social media and media streets, absolutely panicking. However, is this really a threat to the, let's call it, dominance of the US and the Eurozone as the actual markets that buy from these countries? Phumlani?
Well, I would like to start with the question of the dollar. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, so let me start with the question of the US dollar. Yes, let me start with the question of the US dollar. I think what's very important to highlight at this point is that there is no need for any sort of person, whether it's in South Africa or in the West or anywhere, to be worried that the dollar could be, dislodged from, or its space taken over by another, some form of currency. The dollar remains very much chief. It's the most trusted currency in the global markets because of its stability. It's within a stable political environment as well. It doesn't really. It's a currency that can be trusted over the long term. Even the Financial Times last week during the BRICS Summit, they wrote a very interesting column, basically making the case for the US dollar, that the primacy of the US dollar would be with us for the foreseeable future. So there's no need to worry about that, because even if the BRICS countries, they do propose the alternative reserve currency, at this point, that should be no threat to the US dollar. So there's no need to worry about that. But in my view, if the BRICS countries are proposing that they want to have an alternative sort of currency to the US dollar, I'm not opposed to that. I strongly believe in competition. If they want to sort of change how they trade with one another, what currency they use, that is fine. But that does not change that the US dollar remains the most trusted currency. And again, it's going to be a matter of choices in the market. If you hold foreign reserves or foreign exchanges, what do you go with? So it's a choice that you have to make yourself. So from a currency perspective, there isn't really much the West should worry about them. Now let's come to the economics as well, other than the currency. The economics of this is that what's happening is that with the additional countries that have come through, Ethiopia, Egypt, UAE, and so on, when you look at these countries in their regions, Saudi Arabia, there's also Iran as well. I saw Iran. These countries, basically, they are very much big oil producers, right? So if they are big oil producers, for a country like South Africa, that is an oil importer. We import the oil. We are not really a producer of oil in this country. We don't produce that. So for us to be in that space of such a market that has big oil producers, there might be some opportunities there to strike better deals in terms of the oil that we get, in terms of prices, in terms of trade as well. So on that front, that could be for South Africa be viewed as a sort of a benefit there, in the sense that we're in a group of nations where we can strike perhaps better deals in terms of the oil that we have to import into the country. So I mean, so from an economic perspective, remember also these are very much populous countries as well. You look at Ethiopia, I think it's the second, third, if I'm not mistaken, populous country in Africa as well, and it's growing very fast. Ethiopia's economy over the past 20 years, it's been growing very fast. So I think they brought it into the groups of BRICS for that, because of that as well. So, but I mean, for me, from an economic perspective, there isn't really a threat for the West. What I do foresee, though, is the challenge in terms of the geopolitics. What's going to happen that as China sort of galvanizes nations and they are becoming more on their side, they will challenge almost anything that happens globally. It could be the issues in the Middle East. They were going to influence it. That we just saw early this year when China basically brokered the deal between the Iran and Saudi Arabia to restore their relations in the Middle East. So things like that, we are going to see those things coming through with China as it galvanizes these nations and making sure that they are behind them.
I'm going to stick with one issue for now, which you've raised, and I think you've unpacked quite nicely, because it gave us two questions that run from it. And that's on the issue of the de-dollarization. There's two issues that fall under the de-dollarization component or conversation. And I just saw a comment from one of the viewers there, and I'll flight it on screen in a moment, where he rightly says, at the actual BRICS Summit, there wasn't much of a conversation there about the one component, which is the creation of a BRICS currency. There actually wasn't much conversation there. However, the one area or the other side of it, which we've seen some developments, is on the use of local currencies as a medium for exchange or a medium of trade versus using the dollar. Those are the two components. And Nick, I want to come to you on this one, because I think they're worth a little bit of attention. De-dollarization, as I said, has two components. Countries trading in their own currencies. We've seen, for example, Brazil and China formally enter into an agreement to do Brazil and India, pardon me, formally enter into an agreement to do exactly that. And more recently, I'm talking 3 months ago here, President Xi Jinping, put his name there, Xi Jinping visited Russia amid a climate of the war, obviously, that's going on there, to do exactly this, for them to sign an agreement basically allowing Russia and the Chinese to trade in their own local currency. That perhaps has been the biggest development here. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, I'm not a super finance guy, so I'm not going to give too in-depth an answer on this one, but I think that is an interesting development. And it does, and I think, the dollar is not in the greatest position of its entire existence. The Americans have been, sort of printing quite a lot of it, as some of those hilarious clips that you showed suggested. And I think some of these countries, particularly, Russia obviously has been a little bit freaked out by the fact that they got a lot of their dollars and things frozen overseas. So I think some of them are thinking to themselves, well, actually, maybe it's a good idea that we just, shall we say, diversify our portfolio a little bit. But the de-dollarization stuff as like a united BRICS bloc, and I kind of talked about this in my opening remarks. If you actually look through the statement that they put out, the BRICS declaration that they put out at the end of the summit, the thing is so milquetoast. It could have been written by any kind of slightly lefty NGO, development NGO anywhere in the world. It takes hard positions on pretty much nothing. I guess the only controversial thing and it's not even that controversial in geopolitics thing that I noticed to that whole document was welcoming the readmission of Syria into the Arab League. But most of it is like, I mean, for example, on the war in Ukraine, it just says, oh, we all have our national positions. There wasn't, sort of any sort of full-throated endorsement of the special military operation. We support our ally Russia's involvement, blah, 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 nothing like that. And the conflict in Yemen, they just said, we support peace. And the conflict in Libya, they said, we support peace. And the conflict in Niger, they vaguely said, we support peace. So the idea that these countries have enough kind of united ideological and geopolitical purpose to do something like attempt to overtake the US dollar is, I think, just kind of, people building up hype and trying to talk about something that is definitely not on the cards at the moment. If there is an attempt to overthrow the dollar, it'll be done by China itself with the help maybe of some of its allies. It's not going to be through BRICS.
And I think you've raised another important point. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Phumlani, because I think Nick raises an important point here, which comes back to something Nolu actually said. What is BRICS? What is it really? Does it really actually exist? Is it a block?
I think we lost Sitley. Or is it my line?
No, Sitley is definitely gone.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, so please take over.
Yeah, so it's always difficult when you're on someone else's show. But yeah, look, I'll just go back to the last point you brought up there, Nicholas, about how essentially, you're right to mention that there hasn't been much of a mention regarding creating this unified currency, if I can put it like that, by BRICS member states. But maybe going back to you, Nick, can you maybe touch on exactly where do these sentiments actually come from? Is it maybe coming from people whose vested interest is in keeping the dollar going, and so they want to discredit BRICS as a way of, let's call it, an avenue of financial espionage into how currently the way the world is working? Or is it something bigger at play here, such as perhaps saying that these countries, many of them considered emerging and developing markets, is it their way of actually trying to shut out the rest of the world who is dependent on resources from the third world or the global south?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of streams adding to this. Some of it is just the general insecurity that any country on top has. And you can look at any country at any point in history when it's been in a position of power. It often gets caught by some sort of anxiety. Simple example, Britain in the First World War was terrified that Germany was going to build more warships than it, and so overtake it as a global naval power, and then it would be consigned to irrelevance and would lose all of its trade, that kind of thing. Some of this is a kind of, there's a lot of there's a lot of ideological groups that are very strongly anti-Western, strongly anti-American, and they are very keen to kind of prop up this idea. The BRICS countries themselves, I think, particularly Russia, with the situation they're in at the moment, is very keen to kind of suggest that the West's economic and geopolitical dominance is on the verge of collapse. And so I think they're probably encouraging some of this stuff. But I think a lot of it is just that there's this kind of general insecurity. I mean, look, even those thoughts about the West sort of importing raw materials, and that's way overblown. I was actually in the US recently, and I just was reminded by how that country's economy is on another level. The level of infrastructure, the raw materials that they have, and this is a lot of what BRICS feels like to me is kind of a rehash of the so-called non-aligned movement from the Cold War years, where you've got a lot of countries sort of saying, you know, we instead of non-aligned, they now talk about the global South. But a lot of these countries saying, look, we want a better deal, but then they actually can't ever come together because they have too many different agendas. So I think a lot of this is driven mostly by internal politics in the West, because you've got people who are saying, you know, we need to change X, Y, or Z. It can be you insert your favorite political program here, because otherwise we're doomed and China's going to destroy us all. And also just a kind of general anxiety that every powerful country gets from time to time.
And I just caught the tail end of that. I think I agree to a large extent with the points you're making. Phumlani, I'm going to come to you because you wanted to chime in, and then Koketso, I'm going to come to you, and then Nolu. I think as you respond, Phumlani, there's a question I wanted to put up here. What is the BRICS really? Does it actually exist? I mean, some people dismiss it to the extent of saying it's literally a formation, an academic formation from a Goldman Sachs paper that was written. Does it actually have institutions, Phumlani, that can enact the policy ideas that it always talks about? Because arguably, we're not really seeing much in the way of hardcore institutions that enact policy. Let me give one example just to make a point. You would think that BRICS, with it now being over a decade in existence, would have, let's say, a free trade arrangement between these countries. You think it would have free visa movement for all its member partners to each other. This is a conversation that was raised by Patrice Motsepe, for instance, at the BRICS Summit, maybe questioning the fact that there is a lack of actual institutions that give BRICS meat and potatoes.
Thanks, Sihle. Your line wasn't good, but I think I got a gist of what you were asking, and I hope you can hear me properly. My line is just bad. But let me get back to, you mentioned Patrice Motsepe, who said that what needs to happen within the BRICS, which I totally agree with him, is that it shouldn't be a group of countries that basically is about loaning one another cash, right? One country borrowing another country money or grants and so on. It must be about increased economic productivity. And that increased economic productivity can only happen by, as you said, as you've just alluded to, pro-market policies, pro-business policies, relaxed visa regulations. So that's how BRICS can be a benefit if a stronger sort of pro-market environment is created. Now, your question was, could we see that within the next 10 years? Now, we need to be frank and look back at the past 40 years of history, and that is China has, since the late 1970s, China has embraced more pro-market policies within the developing world. And that is why China has sort of rose to the top. In fact, another book, a very fascinating book published back in 2013 by two authors, I can't remember their name, from the Cato Institute. I think it's titled How China Became Capitalist, where they are discussing in the whole book as to what are the pro-market reforms that the Communist Party of China embraced in order to make their economy, more productive. Milton Friedman was in and out of China, when he was still alive, advising the leaders there in terms of how to embrace pro-market reforms. So to answer your question, it's possible because China itself, over the past 40 years, has been on the process of freeing up its economy. So if the Chinese communist leaders can bring that sort of thinking within the space of the BRICS, along with South Africa as well, along with some others, to sort of create the culture of the free market sort of way of organizing economies or trading within the BRICS, that would be a benefit for the countries involved.
Absolutely. And I fully agree on that. Nolu, I'm going to come to you just after Ukoketso. And let me just quickly say this, guys. Apologies to dear viewer. We're struggling tonight with the software and generally the quality of the lines. I think it's mostly load shedding. And they're like, but we'll power through. This is Liberty and Friends. Koketso, well, actually, let me come to Nolu. I think it was Koketso earlier on. I'm not sure. I was also out of the room for a moment. And Saz, Nolu, I want to quickly ask you just a very particular question because I think there is a component here that needs to be addressed. A lot of people, when you think of China, or rather, a lot of people, when you think of BRICS, and I want to rehash this question. I don't see the benefits of BRICS right now as an ordinary South African by way of, for example, as I raised earlier on, free visa travel, or even unhindered access to their markets. Why am I raising this point? I think there's something to be said about the internal contradictions and conflicts between countries like India and China, and actually even African countries. Let me be precise and specific. To me, BRICS doesn't make sense because it might stand to reason that if China, with its industrial base, would be very hesitant of seeing African countries like South Africa eat their lunch by industrializing at a rapid pace, because it might mean for them that they lose that industrial base. Now, let's bear this in mind as I say this. China right now has a massive youth unemployment problem. It's sitting at 20%. Perhaps China's not really interested in seeing Africa rise up to be countries that are more than just exporters of raw materials. Your thoughts? You're muted, Nolu.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so sure. So I think for me, I 100% agree with you. I don't see the benefit in this. We've been there for some time now, been hearing about it. I haven't seen much, I could say, impact into the country, even the people, or like as in ordinary South Africans. As well as I think that at this moment, the countries that are there, for instance, India has a rapid growth currently when it comes to the economy. India is getting like so many powerhouse brands like Apple, they are taking their factories, they're putting them into India. I think it's a very competitive group, first and foremost, which most of the countries, according to what I see, they wouldn't necessarily want to share what they have in its full capacity. For instance, as you just said right now, I don't think China would want us to be more industrial as we used to be in the past. China wants to keep on taking and being the powerhouse. So each country has got their own motive of growing as much as they can. And as we know, China and India, they're really enemies right now because of this whole thing of numbers, and they're really competing when it comes to numbers of the country. So at this moment, I think everybody in that seat, or rather in that group, wants their own. And at this point, I just think for us particularly, I don't think we are at the strong point to really fight for our own, to say that, you know what, we want X, Y, Z, because all countries, they know where we stand right now. And I was hoping maybe Ramaphosa would be that president to say that, guys, can you at least give us X, Y, Z, something that would really benefit us as a country. But right now, I think it's more really just to loan us money. I mean, really, as Mtsipo raised that point, where can we really just get free visas? I mean, we're all friends right now. What's the point of me having to apply for a visa if I want to go to China or other countries that are in the BRICS? So at this moment, I think it's going to be a difficult one to really have strategic, impactful relationships with one another that can open up more market and more what's this, agreements in terms of in paper, that, you know what, I'll give you this, give me that, and that would benefit all of us, because everybody wants to gain something right now. I just think it's just a beautiful way of spending money and looking cute, or being a threat to America. I don't think America should really feel the pinch, but hey, they're feeling it already.
Koketso, I'm going to come to you because it comes back to that question I think I was trying to pose to everybody. And Phumlani gave a very strong indication of how he feels about this. BRICS itself, it has to start developing solid institutions that then generate that meat and potatoes, if you will, of all of the bluster, of all of the projections, of all of the talk that happens at this BRICS Summit. And I frame it this way, because the BRICS really was just a lot of talk. Let me be precise and specific by going to this pardon me, EWN piece, pardon me. Even as I'm doing that, let me just take a moment to remind you, dear viewer, to please hit that like button right now. There it is, the headline, you can see it there on screen. BRICS Summit finale. Member states adopt new declaration. Now, here's what got interesting for me as I quickly read here. BRICS delegates spent the last 3 days locked in talks to strengthen economic and political relations between the 5 member states. The BRICS Summit was held, of course, in the backdrop of renewed calls for the Global South to assert its dominance in the global economy, the political stability, and reforms to financial markets. Now, this is what I was trying to get at as the point of, we didn't actually see hard announcements around, we will establish a BRICS armed force to address security concerns in here, or we will establish a business forum that can actually change visa policy, economic policy, and the like. There's nothing like that. Instead, this is what we heard come out of this country in terms of this 26-page declaration that was at the conclusion of the summit. The BRICS leaders believe the last resolutions will be underpinned by greater representation of developing countries and inclusive multilateralism. The 26-page declaration includes calls for, quote, peaceful resolution to global conflicts, especially calling for diplomatic talks to resolve the crisis in Niger and a ceasefire in Sudan. That's it? A peaceful call, not an establishment of a standing army that can address these issues? Let me go to the economy. I mean, if they're just saying they're calling for stuff on issues of global security, then maybe there's something more tangible on the economic side. Well, BRICS leaders have also agreed to, quote, agitate for the reform of economic policies and to manage the implications of the rising geopolitical tensions on global financial stability. That's it? Just agitate for something? Guys, this is where I'm coming from when I say BRICS, for me, I'm skeptical of it because it doesn't actually put in place hardcore institutions that address change in this country. Something like the EU, for example, hardcore institutions. Something like America via AGOA and NATO, hardcore institutions that enact stuff and bring in partners. Koketso, this is my criticism. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's correct criticism. Look, for those who do think that BRICS is nothing more than a talk shop, there is some merit to that suspicion. Like you mentioned, there is no evidence of a hardcore institution. I'll just bring this back to China and Russia specifically. Again, they sit on the Security Council, and you haven't heard outright statements from those 2 nations coming out and saying that they will forward the interests of their BRICS and BRICS allies to the UN Security Council. Nothing being set up there. In terms of the economical benefit as well, let's just maybe go through the short list here. Russia, let's start with the B. Brazil, big exporter of gas, solid energy. Yeah, solid energy industry in the Petrobras is quite a big company, state-owned enterprise. That is playing in the petroleum space, exporters of oil, exporters of iron, I believe as well, iron ore. That's another one. You know, this is raw material here. So, do they have an important seat at that table in terms of raw material, primarily to the U.S. market? Yes. That's just Brazil. Russia, natural gas exporter, primarily supplying a lot of Europe. We saw the implications of laying sanctions on Russia there for the rest of Europe. India, again, one of the best refiners of oil, much of it coming from the Middle East, also a big exporter of technical skills globally and information age workers. 1 billion plus population, so you cannot ignore them. And big focus on education. So there's a lot of skilled workers coming out of there. China, anything and everything you'll find in China, they've now pegged themselves as being the manufacturing leader globally. Western economies are really growing on the back of Chinese manufacturing, or let me rather say cheap Chinese manufacturing. And then, of course, South Africa being the African footprint, potential largest producer of gold, no longer the largest. Ghana is now producing more gold than South Africa is. Make of that information what you will. And of course, some key minerals, primarily in diamonds, which India also has, and the likes. So even at an economical level, there is leverage for BRICS nations to actually pull together and start saying that, right, they are going to start influencing, firstly, the price of some of these materials, and also maybe have a say on the global demand for some of these resources, like the Middle East has managed to do with oil, despite not being the biggest producers. No institutions or no plan for an institution to be put forward regarding oil, diamonds, gas, and some other minerals. Nothing like that being put to the table. And therefore, you can then make the argument that perhaps this is just a talk shop. Now, maybe on a military level, you may perhaps say that the long game here is to create an anti-NATO of sorts. But that doesn't seem to be the case either. No joint developments on arms and armaments. Instead, it's the usual where China's trying to do its own thing to square up to the United States. Russia's also doing its own thing to square up to the United States. And both of them seem to be far behind the United States in terms of military capability. No talks between South Africa, which has some key IP in there. No talks with Brazil either. And not much happening with India besides the ongoing conflict between India and Pakistan. So nothing militarily, nothing economically, nothing in terms of actually controlling or influencing the demand for raw material and setting yourselves up as something that can push back against the West, which is building its economy off the back of knowledge work right now. So really, what is the point here? There's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. And every time there is a BRICS summit, this was not the first one, let's remember that, we've never actually had answers. So this summit was all about potentially adding new members. But if I ask the common man on the street who is even following this, they can't tell us what were the results of the previous BRICS summits before that, because like we mentioned, we still require visa access to some countries within BRICS. There isn't a political hegemony either, and there isn't an outright effort for the two members of the BRICS coalition that is in the Security Council to actually come out and say that they will be representing the interests of everyone else within BRICS. So long story short, what is it? What is its purpose? And we've asked this question earlier this episode, but maybe we'll have to wait for the next BRICS summit as well.
Just
Okay,
one thing,
guys.
Can I jump in, Sihle?
Go ahead,
On
Phumlani.
the point, on the point of the military sort of pact, which you have dropped that, and I hear Koketso as well is dropping that. I would not really even recommend that BRICS thinks about that thing of the military pact at this point. The moment nations form military pacts, that's when it gets really sort of, there is that apprehension, and the West would really be seriously concerned that these guys are now forming a military pact. So I think that I like what Koketso has sort of listed as the potential of these nations, what they can produce, what they could sell and produce in the global market. To me, it's a reminder that there is much opportunity here. If, as you said, Sihle, earlier, that the institutions that will really drive pro-market reforms are in place, and that reform itself is sped up in them, within the BRICS. Now, there's something else that I think it came through one of your viewers about. I think they raised the fact that these are sort of different countries with different ideologies, different cultures. Yeah, that can happen, but I'm not sure that would be sort of a blockade to trading with one another and facilitating investment simply because our cultures are not the same. By the way, the United States and China, they are so intertwined. The way their economies are like this. Over the past 6 months, the American and American leaders, both from business and politics, have been in and out of China trying to make the relationship to work, simply because really their economy, they are so linked that doing away with one another. In fact, I read one piece today. I saw another headline saying that if these countries, China and the US, were to do away with one another, both of them would be sort of in a worse position. So my point here is that we sort of, it's possible that the economic reforms and stronger trade and investment can take places, even though these countries could be sort of have different cultures, way of governance, and so on.
I want to throw in Nick here. And as we sort of taper off our conversation, we're in the last 20 minutes or so of the show. Welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. We're in conversation with Phumlani Majozi, of course, is an analyst who you'll find on various writing platforms. So he'll share those at the end of the show. Nolu Maki, host of the Nolu Maki podcast. And of course, Ukoketso Resane, host of the Man Patria show. And of course, Nick Lorimer, host of the Daily Friend show. Nick, I have to come to you. Look, I've made my reservations quite clear here. And I think one of the last questions I really wanted to pose, if I just quickly go back to my notes, and watch me now struggle to find my actual notes again. Yeah, I'm struggling. There we go. I think there's something to be said for the conversation looking at each of the individual BRICS countries themselves. Not everything is hunky-dory with these countries. They walked into this BRICS Summit with massive internal pressures in their each individual countries. And let's go by that acronym of BRICS. Let's start with Brazil. Brazil right now is in a lot of trouble when it comes to the internal politics, perhaps, stemming from the last election, where you'll remember the courts got involved in barring the opponents of the current president, Lula da Silva. That's a one, I can't remember his first name, Bolsonaro was his surname.
Jair, something like
that. Jair Bolsonaro, very popular candidate, their version of Donald Trump, if you will, barred, if you will, by the courts from contesting in this election. That tension hasn't gone away. Also, Lula da Silva's gone back effectively to that tension. But there's also a bigger issue there of rapidly rising inflation, poverty rising, and as I mentioned, that political divide. I'll just quickly go down the line here. Russia, for obvious reasons, the war, and of course, Putin's ever-increasing isolation on the global page. India, perhaps faring best of them all, but has policy issues that constrain its economy, or will constrain its economy going forward, of basically being a bit like South Africa, where it has a big market, a big economy, but also each sector dominated by a big player. So very little space for entrepreneurs, albeit they are there, don't get me wrong. I think that's more of a policy issue on that. So for instance, on the automotive side, you'll get the likes of Tata, I can't remember the other one, but there's two, Mahindra, for instance, who then basically, in collusion with politicians, write policy that benefits them at the expense of smaller players. That's India's massive problem, a bit similar to us, if you will, a sort of corporatist arrangement. And of course, China walked in with a massive debt bubble. China is in a lot of trouble. I don't care what people say here of, oh, China is going to take over the world economically, hapati hapata. That's simply not going to happen, given that debt bubble that it has, that Phumlani rightly raises, is very much linked to its relationship with the Americans, a massive housing debt bubble in China too. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, a youth unemployment rate, which is at scary, scary levels, 20% and climbing. So these countries, if I whittle it down to the question, which will be for everybody, but I'll start with Nick. These countries walked into the summit themselves under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I think that's about right. There was a space maybe 5 years ago where I think the anxiety about China really started to ramp up in the West. And there was good reason for that. China was looking really solid. But it in particular, I think, has demonstrated the problem with authoritarian societies, right? Democratic societies, they have their issues. They're sometimes badly governed. We can talk about that problem all the day, all the time. But authoritarian societies are a risky bet for business. China had this massive uplift in its economy. It took hundreds of millions of people out of poverty by embracing a whole bunch of market reforms. But you can see the fear that's begun to develop as it's got an emerging middle class. And Xi Jinping has begun to roll back some of those things. He talks about how SOE should be at the center of China's economy. He's prosecuted Chinese businessmen, very powerful businessmen, for not being enough in line. they had a bad COVID, and they had some really ridiculously harsh lockdowns, which some businesses, I think, got a bit freaked out by, because suddenly their factory workers were, shut in the factory and not allowed to produce a material. And so I think that, as Phumlani pointed out, the US and China have had this very interdependent relationship, and I think that is starting to come apart now. I think a lot of businesses in the West have freaked out a little bit and said, maybe we should, what do they call it, de-risking, diversify to other countries. So India is the big beneficiary of a lot of this. Things are being moved there. Vietnam is another beneficiary. Authoritarian like China, but they don't have quite the same geopolitical ambitions as China, I think. So BRICS is definitely I think each individual piece, except for maybe India, are probably in a worse position than they were a while ago. India, though, you talked about some of the regulatory problems it has. And India's biggest problem, I think, in a lot of ways, is it's a really chaotic place. It's federal, which I think is very good, and that provides for a lot of good stuff. But India has, for example, major ethnic and religious tensions in various regions of the country. Narendra Modi's government has been accused of sort of backsliding on some democratic stuff. And I mean, this is a weird fact that I often see, is that India still has the world's largest insurgency, which is the Naxalist Marxist movement, which basically runs amok in some of the jungles of sort of central eastern India. So, India's improved massively since the 90s. It's also lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but it's still got a very long way to go. And I think all of these countries do sit in a little bit of a position where they've made a lot of progress, but they're not sort of secure, I think, in their prosperity yet. And China in particular, I think, is in many ways simultaneously the strongest, but also possibly the most fragile of a lot of those ones.
Koketz, I want to throw it to you.
Yeah, Nick has basically warped my mind a little bit here, but I think it was a good reminder that none of these countries are actually, none of them are in a position of strength, if I can put it like that. Each one has crippling problems, actually, especially at the political front. And so you can say that they have no business actually playing kingmaker or playing a game of chess where you don't have any control of your pawns, but you want to take full control of your bishops, for example. So yeah, I think the reminder is there and it's good, but the one thing that this does actually send, well, the one message that is actually sent by all of this is that none of them have their houses in order. And until they can, this is a Jordan Peterson reference, I guess, but, until they can clean up their own room, then they have no business trying to clean up the rest of the world. And it's starting to look like that's exactly what some of the ideals and the goals are with all of them, really. Russia, of course, is the common one, but even inside of China hasn't exactly won with some of its key challenges right now. And again, a lot of them are related to simply being one, having a very big population and having to keep everyone happy is very difficult. This is how you get authoritarian regimes really clamping down to maintain an element of control. When you've got that many people, it's actually easier to overthrow the government, unless the government really does put its foot down as quickly and as hard as possible. Brazil hasn't had political stability in probably, we're approaching over a decade now already. And it's easy to forget this, but again, this is one of the things that really does hamper the economic development of even the ordinary man on the street. If things keep changing politically and there isn't an element of stability, your financial sector isn't going to have the best time of its life. So there's also that, South Africa, 9 wasted years. We were all quick to jump on that, but arguably life is worse right now under Cyril Ramaphosa's government than it was even under Jacob Zuma's government. Cyril will, of course, say that he was dealt a bad hand with the pandemic, etc. But no one really put a gun to the president's head and said, you need to appoint a group of ministers who are going to make sweeping changes to everyone's ordinary lives by instituting one of the worst lockdowns known to mankind. So with all that said, really, it's a good reminder that until each of these countries can, demonstrate an element of strength or a let me say, an overachievement in actually how they handle their internal affairs, then putting them together isn't really going to make anyone's eyes bad. If you're sitting in the White House, for example, or you're sitting at the EU Parliament in Brussels, or you're sitting at the German Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, or over in New York on Wall Street either. So yeah, long story short, I would say that perhaps there's an element of delusions of grandeur regarding this entire BRICS element. But me, as a normal citizen, I would like to see some element of economic benefit for me, whether it means easier access to markets as a businessman, whether it means easier travel, therefore, let's say increased tourism between all the different countries, or even if it comes down to, let's ignore the economic aspect of this, but let's go into something that's a little bit more long term. Joint agreements, for example, into space exploration. Would have been very nice to see India having landed craft on the moon. It would have been very nice to have something like that being done by not just India, but India with in a partnership with Brazil, South Africa, Russia. But I believe they were involved, the Chinese, in any case. But yeah, I digress. But we're not seeing much of this anyway. So yeah, maybe we should need to look in the mirror and tell ourselves that perhaps it's better to just, in a sovereign way, deal with our own problems and strike these trade deals with each other without having to make a one hell of a hullabaloo around BRICS and the de-dollarization, etc., etc. But let's see how it goes.
Again, Nolu, as I pose the same question to you, there's something Nkoketo said that I also wanted to touch on. All of these countries had their own internal issues that they walked into the summit having. The one thing we all have in common also, which flies in the face of this suggestion that BRICS is going to be the new big thing, the middle class of each of these countries usually aren't the ones staying in these countries. They're clamoring to move to the very Western countries that they berate. That's the great irony here. South Africa is no different to China. In China, the moment you become wealthy, these folks are moving to your USA, Canada, and Australia is a big market. So it really does ask the question, is BRICS really, is it what it's made out rather to be?
See, I think, firstly, to be honest, I don't see anything wrong with BRICS. Here's why. When each of the countries, they know their struggles first and foremost. It is a good idea for them to sit down and actually talk and say, you know what, say for instance, us here, what are you facing currently, Phumlani, in your country as a president? What do you want to see? How can we benefit each other, or how can we assist you right now? I mean, they know their struggles. I was hoping, looking at someone like Putin, looking at someone like Xi Jinping, they would come full force and say, you know what, South Africa, I want this from you. I want that from you. I want this. At least we would know the intentions, exactly what do they want from each other. Right now, we are not getting that. Of which, for me, I'm quite surprised. Like I say it again, looking at knowing how Putin is, knowing how Xi Jinping is with his people, I would have thought at least they would have a clear intention exactly what they want from each other. Because I believe that they do need one another somewhere or the other in terms of that, how can they benefit with each other. But at this point, it's not there. It's not clear exactly what is actually happening there. And I think they're missing an opportunity from one another. There's a great opportunity in terms of how they can, all of them, uplift their economies. Of course, not to solve all their problems, but a part, like something that they can benefit, because no one, I don't think they can do that for one another. But I think they can form a really solid alliance that can put them into a place that they can really be respected. I know China is respected, and all of them, they stand in a different place, but it can really put them in a place where really the West will be like, okay, great. So this is happening, this is going on. So now we need to treat this group with clear, with respect, because this group, they know what they want, they know where they're going, and they've got an agreement. Whether that agreement would benefit the ordinary person, the middle class, it's then to be seen, right? But at least they actually have something on the table. One thing I hate, I always say, it's like someone who's not clear of their intentions, because you're wasting my time, you're wasting the resources of everything that they're actually putting into the whole summit right now, of our country for that matter. So I'm quite disappointed at especially Putin for that matter, and Xi Jinping, because I thought they would really be saying, this is what I want. And then we know. And then we can decide whether or not we're agreeing with them. I hope that will come in the near future.
Again, even as you're saying that, Nolu, and Phumlani, I must throw it to you, because I think this question is one which answers the overall story of BRICS, as to whether it is a paper tiger with potential going forward if it puts in place those institutions that we spoke of, that then are able to enact policy on the economic front, on the political front, and of course on the security front. But as I frame this question walking into this, each of these countries, Phumlani, have significant problems that they walked into this summit with. And I really want to drill down to this point. Their inability right now to maintain a stable, growth-orientated, free society of middle-income to wealthy individuals who actually stay in their countries is a massive indicator of where freedom really lies. Again, freedom is a necessary condition to economic development, but it's not a sufficient one, but it's a necessary one. And this is where seemingly these countries lag behind, in particular, of course, in China, front and center to that accusation. Your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Sihle. Well, we need to remember that we are in competition as a developing world. We are competing with the West. So if you are an emerging sort of person, you come from a township, you graduate, you get good grades, you go into a good university, you start a very good job, you earn good money, things, they stabilize, and then maybe some dude from Europe, proposes or offers a job or an opportunity for you, you choose to still go there because the conditions there are still better than here. So at the end of the day, as the developing world, in reality, we are in competition with the developed world. Hence, you see many people who, as soon as they see an opportunity to move to the West, they will do that because there are greater opportunities there, there are stronger economies, there's more safety, there's more individual freedom, which we lack here in very, very huge part, or at least in many of the developing countries. So that trend, Sihle, is still going to be there, so long as the sort of a forceful, sort of speedy process within the developing world takes place, and that process is a process of reformed economies that have strong economic growth, reduce unemployment, reduce criminality in South Africa, the crime problem, which we all know here. So safety matters, service delivery. So long as we can create an environment that I, as someone who, I have a family, that I choose to stay here and not migrate overseas, right? So long as these countries don't create such environments, people will always see what is better out there, where are the greener pastures, and then they will choose to move there. Now, your point that when we entered this BRICS last week, these countries, they were in bad shape, one could argue, especially in their domestic politics. That is true. And the unstable sort of politics and policy confusions in these countries from a public policy perspective, it has impacted their economies. That's why we have been talking about this slowdown that we've been laying out, from Brazil to Russia, of course, in a war situation now, to China. China is slowing. I tweeted or posted on X a chart that showed the long-term economic growth of China from the 1980s. It's slowing down now compared to the previous decades. And then I saw this other interview this past week, this other business person on Bloomberg saying the problem in China is Xi Jinping, who is sort of moving away from the reforms that began in late 70s of the more pro-market orientated way. Xi Jinping has been throttling the private sector since he's really moving in, suppressing it, and that is constraining the Chinese economy. And he has been a factor in slowing down the economic productivity in China. So I mean, those so we do compete with the Western world, the developed world, and it's a challenge. And as Nolu is saying, BRICS must be about, and Koketso as well, they are making the case here. And in listening to them, they are not opposed to the BRICS sort of formation. It's about what is going on there. Are there sort of stable or forecast goals to create an environment that is more free trade, more pro-market, stronger economic growth, safety, and so on. And that is what these BRICS countries, they have to deal with. As South Africa, I think our interests must be clear that we want to get into good trade and investment deals. And we also need, even on our side as well, to make sure that we sort out things like the energy, that we don't have all this state-controlled supply of energy and other issues in our labor market that is dominated by the likes of COSATU and so on, and they are making a huge influence there. All those things we need to get right.
Absolutely, absolutely, including, of course, getting rid of ILO, EBE. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw that video clip of Umpegi. I don't know where he was speaking, but he told the tale of how, for instance, one of the power stations that Eskom has been struggling to get back online, Ikusile, or rather not struggling to get them back online, but rather struggling to get online. Kusile at some stage had invited Indian technicians, an Indian company, to come and sort the issue out. The company does the work in no time and then is kicked out effectively of that work because it's required to comply with BEE. I mean, it's absolutely stupefying that this is the sort of self-own goals, if you will, that we are pushing.
It's a matter of time with BEE. It's a matter of time. I think many people see that they are seeing this thing is becoming ridiculous, to be frank with you. At one day.
Even China actually asked the ANC to go a little bit softer on.
I heard about that.
Especially when it comes to power. Yeah.
Who's this guy from Nigeria? Dangote. He complained about it years back. That it affects capital flows, it affects foreign investment, it makes trade in trade between South Africa and other countries in Africa more difficult.
Absolutely.
Again, yeah.
Guys, with us being in the last 2 minutes or so, I'm just going to give everybody a very briefly 40 seconds, guys. Your last say, your last word, and of course, how people can reach you on whatever platforms you write on or social media and the like. Nolu, I'll begin with you. Ladies first.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sichlef, again for having me. I think I've shared my thoughts about the topic of today. Like I said, I'm hoping it can really get better with time. And I just, where people can find me, of course, you can find me on X and all social media platforms. I still am taking quite a long break when it comes to the podcasting. I will get back to it. It's just a matter of being busy. Once again, thank you for having me, and thank you to your great guest as well.
Absolutely. That is Nolu Maki, host of the Nolu Maki podcast. You can find her on her social media. There it is on screen. Shout out to Ular Solis, who does this excellent service. You'll find Nolu Maki, of course, on her Twitter, or X, as it's now called, Nolu Maki. Coquette, how do the folks find you, and what can we expect on ManPatria, and your final thoughts?
Yeah, so best place to find me is probably on X. I haven't gotten used to calling it that yet, so it's still the Bluebird app as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, in terms of ManPatria, I think, yeah, stay tuned. Website is still up. Yeah, this is going to be a year where, well, this is the year where a lot of us are hell of busy at ManPatria. So yeah, for now, best place to get hold of me at the very least is, yeah, find me on X. And just a final thought on today's topic as well. Look, from what I can see just on social media, a lot of people seems to be putting all their eggs into this BRICS basket about how, BRICS, the strengthening of BRICS is going to solve all of South Africa's problems, from power stations to unemployment to the weakening rand. No, that's not what's going to happen. No one is coming, and until we can put in effective leadership internally, we dare not depend on those from outside to come and fix our own problems. When you've got a leaking roof, you fix it yourself. You don't shout, you don't climb the roof and shout for others to come and fix it for you.
Absolutely. That is, of course, Ukoketo Resane of the ManPatria. Make sure you find them on their social media and, of course, at their websites, manpatria.co.za. Nicolas Lorimer, host of the Daily Friend Show. What can we expect from the Daily Friend? How do the folks reach you? And, of course, your final thoughts.
Yeah, no, so dailyfriend.co.za or the Daily Friend Show YouTube channel or the Daily Friend Show on any of the podcast apps. My final thoughts, I'm I didn't know where else to put this, but I just need to say it in public. I kind of loved that those Griffin jets were flying around. We bought those stupid things. They were way too expensive. We could have bought F-16s, whatever. We got them. No one else uses them except for, I think, Brazil and Hungary and the Swedes who invented them. And those pilots never get to fly them except at the Rand Easter show. And so I at least, I like the fact that there was a bit of spectacle. I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. I know it's a waste of money, but really, we never get to see those things fly.
Shout out to Nick. Unfortunately, for some Santon residents, those things became an annoyance and a half.
They were over my house every 30 minutes, but I kind of love the sound.
Dude. At some stage, I was like, oh my God. Okay. That's Nicolas Lorimer, host of the Daily Friend Show. Please make an effort, find them. They come to you daily, Mondays to Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, at 1:30 p.m. That's dailyfriend.co.za. Phumlani, last but not least, how do the folks find you on your social media? And of course, what can we look forward to from Phumlani insofar as what you may be writing or opining about? And of course, your final thoughts on tonight's topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sihle. It was a pleasure to be participating in this very fascinating conversation. I am on X, at Phumlani Majozi, so that's where you will find me. I have a website as well, phumlanimajozi.com. It's got my content there, the updates about where I also speak in conferences where I speak, as well as my articles. I also run them there on my website, so phumlanimajozi.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, Phumlani Majozi. I'm on Facebook, Phumlani Majozi as well, the Facebook page. So those are the platforms you will find me. I'm working on a book. In fact, I've finished it. It's being published later this year. In November by Tracy McDonald Publishers. So people must keep track of that on my online platforms. I'll be posting more about it. So I look forward to that, my first book. And then on my parting thoughts, BRICS is an opportunity. The idea, as Nolu is saying, is not a bad idea. I'm not opposed to it. It's a good idea. The question is what happens. The devil is in the detail, they say. What is within that? And what can we do to work together or to foster sort of the pro-market, pro-individual freedom change within these countries? If we can push that, we can make a huge difference to be in and get to a situation where we don't see the middle class that you speak of jetting off and migrating to developed countries. So it will begin with doing things like this and getting them right with the right policies.
Absolutely. That is, of course, Phumlani Majozi. A very big thanks to him for joining us tonight. And again, Phumlani, you're someone who I'm hoping we'll have on the show a lot more regularly. But I'll speak to you offline. I've got like an evil villain. I'm cooking up a plan. But nonetheless, major thanks to Phumlani for joining us tonight, and thanks really to all my guests for joining us tonight as I get them off screen. Again, thank you to all of them. Thank you to you, dear viewer, for joining us and watching tonight's episode of Liberty and Friends. Remember, we are pretty much back to producing content at the usual rate. So Monday to Friday, the Vuganazo show from 7:30 a.m. A minimum of at least one a day. Sometimes we do two. So look out for those on the channel. So make sure you subscribe. Of course, every second Wednesday, on the show, we have the Big Daddy Liberty Show. That's Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. We have a show this week where we'll be looking at the Zimbabwe elections, that shenanigans, and wow, I nearly swore. That show of an election that happened in that part of the world. So I'm busy putting together some expert voices, some actual Zimbabwean influencers who can chat to us about the election or that non-election, if I'm to be honest. Look out for that. That's this Wednesday at 7:30. And of course, I'll see you again next Sunday for Liberty and Friends, Sundays at 8 p.m. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. And as I like to say at the end of every broadcast, never trust a commie.